Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian for the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. Sarcopenia is the loss of muscle tissue as a natural part of the aging process. Did you know that after age 50, muscle mass decreases at an annual rate of 1 to 2%, and muscle strength declines by 1.5% between ages 50 and 60? It is estimated that 5 to 13% of people 60 to 70 years of age are affected by sarcopenia, with those numbers increasing up to 50% for those aged 80. But is there a way that we can slow this process down or even prevent it from happening? In this podcast, we speak with Dr. Sara Oikawa from the Gatorade Sports Science Institute about strategies to minimize muscle loss as we age. We'll discuss the impact of exercise and exercise type, dietary factors and the importance of protein, and are there any dietary supplements that can play a role? Dr. Oikawa is the Associate Principal Scientist at the Gatorade Sports Science Institute Satellite Lab at IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. She earned her Honors Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, Masters of Science in Kinesiology, and her PhD in Kinesiology at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. Sara's master's focus on resistance training, load-mediated muscle hypertrophy, and trained young adults. Her PhD work focused on dietary protein quality and alterations in protein metabolism, specifically muscle protein synthesis in both inactivity and resistance training models. In her spare time, Sara enjoys traveling, hiking, cooking, and watching Toronto-based sports teams. We'd also like to thank our partners at Gatorade for sponsoring this podcast. Sara, thank you so much today for joining us at the All Me podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Okay, this is a really cool topic and probably one that people are just going to go, all right, I'm really interested to know age-associated muscle loss. I know we're going to dive into the research, the ins and outs, the causes, all that stuff. Before we really dive into that and kind of learn, we got to learn a little bit about you first. I always want to learn more about our guests to get an idea of your career path, what interested you to become a sports scientist, and then how did you get to GSSI? So just tell us a little bit about your background and what basically gave you an interest in doing what you do now.
Yeah, so what gave me an interest in sports science was probably, I think, a lot of individuals in this area, a lot of researchers in this area are usually drawn to it because they had some involvement in sport growing up. So I'm no different in that respect. I played a lot of soccer growing up, and that's kind of what piqued my interest, along with an interest in biology. And so I completed all 3 of my degrees, so my undergrad, my master's, and my PhD, all in kinesiology, all at McMaster University, which is located in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And I'd say originally, as I progressed through my undergrad and into my master's, which was very young adult focused, it was very hypertrophy focused. How do we get the most out of resistance training gains? And that was great for my master's. I really enjoyed that. And then I was really fortunate to work through my undergrad, master's, and PhD with Dr. Stuart Phillips, who has a really large breadth of what we study in the lab. And so we study both young adults and older adults. And so through that, I got the opportunity to shift when I moved into my PhD to look at older adults and then age-related muscle loss or sarcopenia. And something that really interested me and something that I studied throughout my PhD was the effects of protein quality and the effects of both exercise and disuse on how that impacts muscle mass in older people. So we know that, and we'll discuss a little bit later, that there are differences as you age between being young and being older, and how your body reacts to both exercise, disuse, and protein ingestion. And so trying to use some of those concepts to improve muscle health, improve function in older people so that they can have a greater quality of life as they move into older age is something that was really an area of interest for me, as well as trying to reduce those periods of disuse or periods of convalescence in older people, because we know that they're really detrimental. So I had a really interesting kind of path both in young people and maximizing muscle, and then both in older people and trying to attenuate that loss. And then kind of how I ended up with is a little bit of a fluke, actually. So because my area of expertise is in using stable isotope tracers to measure muscle protein synthesis, we had a postdoc in our lab who was conducting a study in endurance trained athletes, and he ended up getting a job somewhere. And so I finished out the remainder of a project that he was working on in endurance athletes. And then I was lucky enough to get to present that data at the European College of Sports Science Congress in Prague in 2019. And that's where I met the GSSI team, and my manager at the time happened to be in attendance at that conference and let me know about an open position in the lab. And I applied, and that's how I got here.
That's awesome. That's just a fascinating story. And it's really cool that you had the chance to work with Dr. Phillips, because he was actually on our podcast, I think last year, talking about protein. So that's awesome. That's an incredible story, and great to have you with that. Today's topic is age-related muscle loss. That's really my first question for you. Number one is, what is age-related muscle loss? As it is as simple as the term sounds?
It isn't. It isn't. It isn't that you do lose muscle as you age, but I think the factors surrounding how and when we lose muscle as we age are so much more complicated than that. So you'll hear me toss around the terms sarcopenia and age-related muscle loss kind of interchangeably. And so really what sarcopenia is the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength as people age. And this actually starts to occur likely in the third decade of life, but becomes measurable because the loss is slow at the beginning, becomes measurable in your 50s. And so there are a lot of contributing factors to age-related muscle loss, and we don't exactly know, which ones are the most important or which ones we can effectively, cross out through nutrition or exercise interventions. But they kind of range from hormonal changes, they range from vascular changes. There are also some differences in when we look at satellite cells and rebuilding muscle after exercise or rebuilding muscle after damage. And then there are some factors like nutrition and exercise, which are largely modifiable, that also contribute to the loss of muscle mass with age.
Fascinating. And you mentioned, this is the process that starts right around that 30-year-old, mid-30 range. And there's certain things like hormones that play a factor. Let's kind of talk a little bit about that. So how do hormones really play a factor? Or we know there's anabolic hormones, catabolic hormones, but where does that play a role when it comes to muscle loss?
Yeah, so I think that when we talk about hormonal changes and muscle mass loss, one of the clearest areas is in older women, where we see following menopause. There's obviously this drastic change in their hormonal milieu. And what we know is that following, a few years, 2 to 3 years following menopause, that older women experience this increase in arterial stiffening because estrogen can work as a vasodilator. So when we have decreased levels of estrogen as they move, past menopause, there is this increased stiffening, which leads to an increase in not only cardiovascular disease occurrence in older women, but also reducing the ability to move nutrients and reduce blood flow to muscle. And so we're still kind of at the very, very tip of the iceberg here and trying to understand how menopause impacts muscle mass in women. But we know that there are some sex differences that exist as we move into older adults that we don't see in younger adults in regards to skeletal muscle metabolism. But we're still trying to work that out and still trying to understand changes in hormones can be either positive or negative in older people, but that work is ongoing.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you started mentioning females with menopause, right? So my next question was really around gender. I mean, is there any impact on gender, whether do males lose muscle faster, or do they start younger? Do females change? And how does gender play a role, I guess, in how one loses muscle? Does one happen at a faster pace, or is it pretty equal across the board?
Yeah, it's pretty equal across the board. And then when we look at periods of forced disuse, so that's either bed rest, step reduction, or mobilization. So we use kind of one of those intense casts that you would see following maybe like an ACL reconstruction. Sorry. What we see is that the loss or the rate of muscle mass loss between males and females is very similar. Where we do start to see difference as we move into older age, again, that we don't see in younger adults, is differences in baseline levels. So rested rates of muscle protein synthesis. We see that females have a higher rate of protein synthesis at kind of their basal level compared to males. How that impacts changes in muscle mass with age, we still don't quite know. I think another issue in this topic is that we kind of largely we have this kind of black box over middle age. So we know a lot about people 18 to 30, and we know a lot about individuals over the age of 60, but kind of between 30 and 60, we have much less data in terms of protein metabolism and how that differs by sex. We can, assume that it's probably very similar, especially in that premenopausal phase, but we just don't have a ton of data right now to support kind of making any strong statements about whether there are sex differences there.
Excellent. Now, we talked about the gender side, the hormone side, just the age side. Outside of those factors, especially age, are there any other primary factors that contribute to muscle loss?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest one here is physical activity, and that's probably not surprising. So it's interesting in the sense that as we age, our levels of physical activity tend to decrease, and that's not the same for everybody. This is kind of a sweeping generalization, but as you move from childhood to early adulthood into your older age, you have less time for leisure time physical activity. And what we know is that exercise is the strongest, one of the strongest factors to increasing rates of muscle building. And so as we decrease levels of exercise as we age, and then we also have this mounting anabolic resistance, which is our what we deem when we're aging, and we have a higher threshold to stimulate muscle building through both exercise and protein ingestion. Those two combined together kind of accelerates muscle loss. So that decrease in physical activity. And then also typically we need more protein as we age, which we'll get into a little bit further. But what we know as well is if we look at masters athletes, so those are individuals that are lifelong exercisers and exercise to both volume and intensity for a prolonged period of time throughout older age. What we see in masters athletes is that they don't lose muscle mass at the same rate as their age matched counterparts. And so maintaining a high level of physical activity into older age can be partially protective against sarcopenia, but what we do know is that it's even masters athletes are not protected fully. And so kind of as we get into the farther end of our older age range, kind of past that 80-year mark, we do still see age-related muscle loss in these athletes, but we know that it is protective.
Yeah, and I feel like you're talking to me because it's like you mentioned, as we get older, exercise becomes a little, less frequent, right? And it is. It's really true. As you get older, when you're in college, I'm like, oh, I can go to the gym. I have all this flexibility. I just got to study and do this. Then you get married and you have kids. And then it's like, wow, I can't go as often. I got to do this. Work gets busier. So I definitely feel those effects. And I was talking to my wife about that this morning. It's like next week, my plan is 4 days or this. And sometimes just things get in the way. It's like it's really a lot more challenging just to get in sometimes 30 minutes. And it kind of leads into my next question about exercise, because you mentioned exercise is a factor. It's important. But is there a form of exercise that is better? So, we look at cardio, we look at strength training. Is there one that is preferred when it comes to maybe slowing down this age-related muscle loss process?
So because the age-related muscle mass process is multifactorial, as we mentioned, there's so many different aspects that impact muscle loss. I think it would be ill-advised to say, one type of exercise is better because they all provide benefits that ultimately impact muscle mass. So for example, doing endurance exercise or cardio exercise, isn't as strong as a stimulus as resistance exercise for stimulating muscle protein synthesis in regards to, those contractile elements or the power elements of our muscle fibers. But what endurance and cardio exercise does is it improves our cardiovascular system. And so maintaining healthy arteries, maintaining a good cardiorespiratory fitness can help in other ways by helping to improve nutrient delivery and keeping your blood vessels happy that are ultimately supplying muscle. Cardio exercise is also amazing for helping to improve glucose handling, which also is important as we age. So there's still an impact of doing all types of exercise to maintain muscle health besides targeting, strength training alone. That being said, strength training is obviously super important for helping to maintain muscle mass and also importantly, and most importantly, for maintaining muscle strength. And so strength and power are really key when we think about moving into older age and maintaining strength and power, because what happens as we age and we lose strength and power much faster than we actually lose volume muscle mass. So muscle's lost at a rate of about 1 to 3% per year, whereas strength and power are lost between 3 and 5% per year. But it's really strength and power that are important. They're the elements that are stopping us from, tripping over a curb or, falling down the stairs. And not only is it not good to trip over a curb or fall down the stairs, but when we have these incidents where we can't generate power fast enough, sometimes older people end up in hospital or they end up, bedridden. And that's where we see an accelerated decline of muscle mass loss and strength loss during those periods of convalescence. And so trying to reduce the incidence of those periods is really key. And so kind of going back to your original question, which form is best, I'd say both forms are excellent. Getting as much as you can in of both forms is important. We'll always recommend, sticking to physical activity guidelines. So 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity a week with at least 2 sessions of strength and power training fit in there. I think the more strength and power training you can fit in, the better. But as you said, Tavis, it's hard to find the time, but making sure that you find the time, and especially the lower limbs, right? It's great to make sure your arms and your chest and your back are huge. But when we think about locomotion and where those why falls and fractures happen, it's typically as a result of lack of power and strength in the lower limbs. So that would be kind of my main focus if we're looking to maintain that strength and power. It's lower limb training.
People were correct when they said once you hit 40, things start kind of breaking and hurting, and it's not as you're not as youthful as you used to be. You don't recover as fast. And at 46, I can feel that after a day of heavier legs, or my wife and I started playing pickleball recently, which, people think isn't that an older person's sport? I'm like, no, go out on the pickleball court for an hour. And the next day your muscles are feeling things that it's never felt before just because of all the stop and start. So I'm definitely feeling it, but you definitely, like you mentioned, you feel better. It's great for the preservation. And it's just good to obviously exercise for so many different reasons. And that's a whole different topic, right? We can get into. Let's dive into diet. I know that's a critical area when it comes to this. And how does diet play a role in muscle loss? My first question when it comes to that is, I guess, the importance of protein. So how important is protein in either preventing or slowing that age-related decline in muscle loss?
Protein is super important, but I think that, before we get into protein recommendations and how they impact age-related muscle mass, this needs to be taken in context of, diet and exercise being both of those modifiable factors to be able to maintain or help to attenuate muscle loss with age, where exercise is really the key component, and protein or other factors of your diet are kind of smaller contributing factors. And so taking this information into account, that it should be in the context of diet, of exercise and protein intake together. And this is partially because when we exercise and consume protein together or in close proximity, muscle protein metabolism are greater than either one independently, than either exercise alone or protein intake alone. So trying to do those things together, consuming protein following exercise and consuming an adequate amount of protein following exercise is really key. Now, when we think about how much protein or the types of protein, starting with the amount, the Institute of Medicine recommends 0.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein for individuals over the age of 18. And this recommendation does not take into account that as we age and over the age of 60, we see this increase in anabolic resistance, which I described earlier, is our reduced ability to stimulate muscle building following ingestion of protein or performance of exercise. And so although 0.8 grams per kilogram per day is the recommendation for generally for adults, we would recommend for older people to be anywhere from 1.2 all the way up to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day for protein to account for this reduced ability to stimulate protein synthesis with protein. And so really what this means is if we think about a young person and the protein that's required to optimally stimulate muscle building processes, for young people, so 18 to 30, we say that this amount is 0.24 grams per kilogram per dose or meal. So 0.24 grams per kilogram. But when we look at this amount in older people, and this was some work that was done by Dan Moore at the University of Toronto, as he used breakpoint analysis to find that in older people, so over the age of 60, that this dose increases to 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal or dose. And so that's almost, over a 60% difference in how much protein is required to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And I think that that's one, a lot of older people don't know that they need that much more protein to stimulate muscle building. But two, we get into an issue in terms of the satiating effect of protein, where consuming that much protein just in a meal form may become difficult for individuals over the age of 60. If you're going to eat all that in chicken breast or eggs or milk, that's a lot of food. And I think the important part too is when we think about the way that North American and European diets are structured is the majority of our protein is consumed at the lunch or dinner meal. So we kind of have this skewed protein intake where we consume very little protein at breakfast, a moderate amount of protein at lunch, and then a lot of protein at dinner. But if we're, getting 0.6 grams per kilogram at our dinner meal, it's not much more helpful than getting 0.4 grams per kilogram, which is that threshold. So trying to space protein evenly throughout the day is really important. About every 3 to 4 hours, consuming a meal that fits within that 0.4 grams per kilogram is ideal. So a high protein breakfast, a high protein lunch, high protein dinner, and then a high protein pre-bed snack is way to space protein. And there's some evidence to show that a more balanced protein intake throughout the day helps to maintain lean mass over time in older people. So we know that kind of looking at longitudinal data that it can be a contributing factor to help maintain muscle mass. But I think really getting a handle on when you're consuming your protein and understanding where you're consuming it and at what level. I think a lot of people are unaware of their patterns and how much protein they're actually getting and when.
Yeah, I agree. I see a lot of clients that the protein intake is a lot lower and the carbohydrate intake is a lot higher. But to just kind of simplify this, especially because we mentioned a lot of things in grams per kg, and some of our listeners that may not work in this field might go, how do I get to that? What does that mean for me? Does that mean if we want to slow down the muscle loss process or even maybe minimize it, would that be about 70% of someone's body weight or 0.7 grams per pound? What would be equivalent to that in grams per pound, as you just mentioned?
Yeah, that's if we cut this part out, I have to do the calculation for you. I know what it is for young people. It's 0.14
Well, and some of the
grams per
research I've
pound.
seen. What's that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's okay. In young people, it's 0.14 grams per pound, but I just have to do that conversion
Yeah,
per
not
kilogram.
really per meal, just thinking per day, like overall.
Oh,
Like
per day.
if I'm a 200-pound person, is it like, hey, do I just need to eat about 70% of my body weight or about 140 grams? Because I think overall that'll probably give someone like, all right, what's the total gram or roughly what's that range? And some of the things I've seen was like, all right, 0.7 to 0.8 grams per pound for the entire day. But obviously you do the research a lot more than I do. And I've just seen so many mixed things, and I wasn't sure if you had kind of like here's a general guideline. Take your body weight, multiply it times 0.7, and boom, that's a great way just to get a good average to maintain muscle mass.
Again, I'm gonna have to do that calculation for you, Dad.
No, that's
So I'm
fine.
sorry.
That's completely fine. I threw a
I find
curveball at you.
no, it's all good. It's 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day is our recommendation for older people, or what is recommended. What that is per pounds, I will need to do
Yeah,
that
no,
calculation.
yeah.
Maybe I can send that to you afterwards.
And I just,
Um,
what I tell a lot of my clients, especially the high performance athletes, the younger is, we want to try to get somewhere between 0.7, 0.8, or if, and I know we're going to, another question coming is a little bit different. So kind of moving away from the performance side and even just age side is it possible to build muscle? Like if someone's in a deficit, everything I've heard is, oh, if you're in a deficit, if you're eating less calories than what your body's burning, you're going to lose muscle. But I've seen some studies that say maybe we can build muscle. Have you seen anything that has shown that we can actually lose weight and build muscle at the same time? Is that possible?
yeah, so we've done some work. both when I was working with Dr. Phillips, as well as some work in the US, has kind of used a similar model looking at extreme caloric restriction and high protein diets to see whether they can attenuate muscle loss. So what we know is with calorie restriction or dieting is that your levels of muscle protein synthesis decrease. Um, and it's what we're kind of understanding when we look at both the protein synthesis and protein breakdown side is that it's really the protein synthesis side of the equation that's going down. So it's not that breakdown is going up necessarily, it's that synthesis or your ability to stimulate muscle building goes down. And so some work that's been done in out of Stefan Pasiakos' lab has shown that when you consume a high protein diet, so even at, I know going back to kilograms here, I'm sorry, 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. So a lot of protein that these individuals consuming at a 40% energy deficit or 40% calorie cut, they're still losing muscle mass over time, over a 4-week or sorry, a 2-week period in when they're dieting. But some work that we did back with Tom Longland when he was a master's student with Stu Phillips was we included a high intensity training protocol over 4 weeks using a very similar protein amount. So we had two groups, one group consuming 1.2 grams per kilogram per day of protein, the other group consuming twice that, so 2.4 grams per kilogram per day. And these individuals were on a 40% calorie deficit and then exercise 6 days a week. So they had 3 days a week of high intensity cycling training, and then 3 days a week of resistance exercise or body weight training or power training. So 2 days a week of resistance exercise circuits and 1 day a week of plyometric training. So it was a lot of work and a lot of exercise for them. But what we found was that over the 4 weeks that there was a significant decrease in body mass in both groups. But what we found was that the group consuming a higher amount of protein was actually able to increase muscle mass. And the group that was on the lower amount of protein, which was still above the recommended levels, was able to maintain muscle mass. They didn't lose any. And so really, boiling that down to the take-home point here is that if you perform exercise, particularly resistance exercise while you're dieting, there is the potential for you to maintain or increase muscle mass as you diet. The difficulty is that in translating this research to older people, where we know that your threshold for stimulating muscle protein synthesis is higher. So does that mean that in order to maintain or gain muscle mass while you're dieting, when you're an older person, whether that protein requirement needs to be higher, and whether your exercise volume needs to be higher, because we know that also that threshold also increases with age, perhaps, but that literature isn't available to us yet. But is it possible? Perhaps. Will it be more difficult? Very likely.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's fascinating just to kind of hear the fact that, hey, there is a possibility that you can still lose weight, lose fat, and still build a little bit of muscle with the right combination. But as you mentioned, even for me, I'm like, that's just so hard to do. When can I get in 6 days of structured activity and truly get my protein and everything exactly matched? I've tried. It's a lot more complicated than people think.
And I think it's hard to, when, if you read the publication, we describe the exercise in great detail, but the intensity that these young men were working at was extremely high. This is something that was an extremely controlled environment. We monitored all their food intake and we monitored all their exercise sessions. This wasn't, here's a plan and go home and do it. And I think that's a lot of what made it successful, was that we're there every step of the way, pushing them for that extra rep, pushing them to beat their personal best in a time trial. So I think keeping that all in context of it was a controlled scientific experiment. This isn't, for everybody that's just at home trying to do their best. I mean, it's not to say that it's not achievable, but it's definitely something to keep in mind when we think about it in the context of science. Yeah. And then quickly, Tavis, if you want to build this in afterwards, you were correct in your grams per pound. So we're looking at a range of 0.5 grams per pound to 0.7 grams per pound.
Okay, cool. No, I think that's, for that person that's listening going, how do I do those calculations? Because most people don't realize, all right, take your body weight, divide it by 2.2. That'll give you kilograms. If you want to go back and listen to that part, it'll kind of help you figure out where are my kilograms, add that to what Sarah's recommendations were based on the research. And there's a lot of different calculations. And for the average person, as you know, if I tell somebody, hey, you need 150 grams of protein, they're going to be like, well, what does that mean? Break that down for me. And that's a whole different topic of conversation that we'll do another day. All right.
Yeah, I think I'm sure if we circle back to Stu's podcast, he probably
Yes.
gives you some excellent recommendations
He
there.
had some fantastic stuff. And yeah, please go back and see Dr. Stu Phillips' podcast just on protein. So he'll give a lot of the answers in that. All right, let's talk about different types of diets because, I'm not a big fan of labeling something a diet or following this or that, but people are. And that's just the nature of what people do. And fasting is one of those things. Intermittent fasting is extremely popular. But I've read where if we fast for extended periods of time, and we'll try to figure out what that definition means, this could cause our body to use more muscle, especially if we're doing that on a weekly basis. Is there any research that you've seen to demonstrate prolonged fasting could cause muscle loss?
Yeah, so kind of going back to what we were talking about in the last question is we know that, even reducing your calories by 300 calories a day for 7 days is enough to reduce your rate of resting muscle building. So to reduce muscle protein synthesis levels significantly compared to baseline or compared to when you're in energy balance. So in 300 calories isn't a lot, right? That's an extra snack per day. Cutting that out is enough to alter your protein metabolism. So when we get into prolonged fasting, there's obviously a limit to the drop in muscle protein synthesis that we can see. And we've seen that in some of our weight loss trials as well. As there's obviously a threshold by which we can't go too low or we'd have a serious issue in being able to maintain body mass or muscle mass. But we do, I guess the point being that it doesn't take very much for you to get into a reduced level of muscle building compared to your baseline.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's something for people to kind of be cautious about. I have friends that they might go on a 24, sometimes a 48, and I've even had a friend do a 72-hour fast, and I'm like, 72 hours, no food, water only. I'm like, I'm chewing probably the front door's wood at some point within 24 hours. But I think that's a whole different topic too.
I
All right,
think like 3 hours is sufficient for me.
I'm just
But
like, all right, I need to give out that morning snack. I can't give up that morning snack if I want to lose muscle. I want to make sure I'm getting enough protein.
and before we move topics here, Tavis, I think the question around intermittent fasting, there are benefits to intermittent fasting in older age, particularly when we look at glucose metabolism. We've seen some of the literature shows that there's benefits in being able to better regulate your glucose levels when you are intermittent fasting. And so that's fantastic if that's something that you need to be working on. Your physician has flagged that you may have, high fasted glucose. This might be a good strategy before medication for you to try. But where, the negative comes in with intermittent fasting is when we talked about in a couple of questions ago about evenly spacing protein throughout the day. We want to make sure that protein is spaced about, 3 to 4 hours between protein doses. So if you consume, your I'm making this number up, but your 40 grams of protein at breakfast and then lunch and then dinner and then bedtime snack. If we move into what intermittent fasting looks like, where you maybe don't eat your first meal until, 10, 11 in the morning and you eat your last meal at 5 or 6 at night, that doesn't leave really enough time for you to get enough protein in at those spaced doses if we're looking at intermittent fasting. And so will that contribute to accelerated muscle mass loss over time? It's tough to say because we don't have that research, but I think that that's just a watch out when we think about intermittent fasting and aging, because we know that older people are not spacing their protein out enough, and we know that they're already in this period of accelerated decline compared to young people. I think if you shift the picture to young people in intermittent fasting, they can recover so much better because they're young and spry, and those rates of protein synthesis are less. That I think that the damage being done, or once they're finished with an intermittent fasting diet, they're able to build that muscle mass back up again. But in older people, we just don't know that it's true, or we know that it's much harder for them to regain any muscle mass that's been lost.
So now you have my nerd nutrition brain coming out, and I'm thinking of a study design because now I'm fascinated to say, all right, let's take young and older individuals, let's fast them for maybe 12 or 16 hours, and then put them an enormous amount of protein later in the day versus spreading out the protein evenly throughout the day for the other group, and seeing which one retains the most muscle and putting them through training programs and whatever it is, whatever that study design. Now I'm like, wow, that would be really cool to look at that. Maybe that's been done, maybe it hasn't, but that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, So I don't think that that literature has been looked at yet, and assuming that you mean over time, because I think in one day we wouldn't really be able to see
Oh
that
yeah, like
impact.
six
But
months or 3 months or things like that.
yeah, it would be really interesting to see. I think where I feel hesitant is that depending on the age of the older person, right? If we know that that rebound is less likely to occur, and when I say rebound, I mean they're going to if they do lose muscle mass over that say 6 month period, when we end that 6 month period, are they going to regain it? And that's where we see a lot of older people having difficulty, even when they're not in a caloric restriction, being able to increase rates of or increase muscle mass again. So that work has been done with some disuse protocols showing that older adults don't fully recover muscle mass lost during following a disuse protocol. It's kind of begs the question. It's an interesting research question, but do we want to put individuals in a period of or a situation where they're losing muscle mass only to know that they might not regain it?
Let's kind of dive into just a little bit more on the diet side. Are there any other diets or types of diets that we should be concerned about that could accelerate the muscle loss process? Whether it's, and I'm just going to throw a few out there, whether it's keto, low carb, anything in general that you've seen in the science that says, hey, be careful because even though you might be doing this to lose weight, you're also losing muscle.
Yeah, I think just in general, when we think about diets, it's caloric restriction, right? At the end of the day, whether you're consuming a lot of protein and a lot of fat or a lot of carbs and less protein, it's when you're restricting calories, you're going to lose body mass. And what we know from dieting is typically about 25% of the total mass you lost. So say you lost 8 pounds, we know that about 2 pounds of that 8 pounds is going to be muscle mass or lean body mass that you lost. And so I think I just caution with any type of dieting, understanding that dieting is important. We need to maintain other bodily functions, and dieting is really helpful there. But with any type of dieting and any type of weight loss, we are losing lean body mass typically. And again, we don't know whether older people are going to be able to fully regain that body mass when they're done dieting. And so I think being really focused on the fact that if you are going to diet, resistance training is so important to build into part of your weight loss journey as well.
Excellent. All right, as we get kind of towards the end, a couple more questions. My favorite topic is always dietary supplements. So I'm going to always throw something along the lines with that. So we know dietary supplements are popular and people take them for a variety of different reasons. Are there any supplements that you have seen that's been proven to either reduce the rate of muscle loss or can even actually maybe help an older adult build muscle?
So that's an excellent question. And so I think a lot of that is being explored. There's some really interesting work that was done by Dr. Kristen Bell when she was working with Dr. Phillips. She's now faculty at McMaster University, where she looked at a multi-ingredient supplement on changes in muscle mass and strength in older men, both before they started a training protocol and afterwards. But the supplement itself was a mixture of omega-3 fatty acids, creatine, vitamin D, um, and whey protein. And she found that this supplement was able to increase lean body mass and strength in older adults without exercise. So we know that there is something within that supplement mixture that's able to help older adults regain or gain a little bit of muscle mass at least, and a little bit of strength. What we know in the omega-3 literature is definitely growing, is we've seen kind of consistently now that older men and women, particularly older women, we see this effect a little bit more, consuming 3 to 5 grams per day of fish oil have shown an increase in muscle strength and in some instances muscle mass. And so there's something about omega-3 fatty acids. There's a couple different ways they could be impacting muscle to benefit it, but we do see kind of a consistent effect, a positive effect of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly fish oil, on muscle mass and strength in older people. Similarly, there's some work that's been done looking at creatine supplementation in older people that has shown a benefit as well. So I think kind of looking at any of those types of supplements in older people, again, the literature is still emerging, but we're starting to see some consistent benefits of using those supplements to improve at least muscle mass and strength in older people.
I'm excited because as someone who's closer to 50 now than 40, which I hate to admit that, I drink my fish oil every day, about 6 grams. I take a little bit of creatine. Protein's pretty adequate. I usually whey protein, and my vitamin D was low, unfortunately. So I'm like, I'm on a 5,000, or I'm taking, a pretty good dose of IU. So I'm like, wow, she said all four things that I'm currently taking. So hopefully I maintain muscle mass based on those recommendations. And I love the omega-3 stuff because that's just a fascinating topic. And I've seen some work on the anabolic signaling. So that's really, really cool that you mentioned that. All right. Last two questions, Dr. Oikawa, is number one, out of everything we've discussed today, and I know this might be a tough question, what are 2 to 3 habits we should practice every single day or at least weekly to slow the age-related muscle decline? What are 2 to 3 things people should do, on a regular basis that can slow this process down?
Yeah, I think this is going to be 0% surprising to anyone that's been listening to the podcast so far, but it really comes down to exercise, in my opinion. Of course, diet is important, but exercise is key, and particularly strength training. So getting in any type of resistance exercise, particularly if you can build in some power training. If you have muscle mass, but you can't use it, quote unquote, if you have muscle mass, but it's not trained to maintain strength or power, then what good is that muscle mass, right? And so really, again, getting back to the fact that if we can maintain strength and power, it reduces our risks for falls and fractures. That reduces our risks for periods of disuse or convalescence or hospitalization, where we know that your age-related muscle loss and strength is accelerated. And so the faster that we have that decline, the harder anything. It's just maintaining that physically active lifestyle, maintaining strength training, maintaining power training. That's my number one. And then my number 2 habit is, of course, then building in a healthy diet. So that means making sure that you're getting adequate protein and trying to space it out evenly across your meals and snacks. And, maybe not ignoring that bedtime snack. Sleep is a period of time where you're not exercising and you're not eating, which means that those 2 stimuli used to increase muscle protein synthesis aren't active as much. And so building in kind of a quick, exercise before bed paired with 30 to 40 grams of high quality protein would be a great strategy, but it's not for everyone. I think a good start is to make sure that you're getting adequate protein and making sure that it's spread out throughout the day.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing is, and I'm going to give a different version, change the Netflix, stop watching the TV, and get off the couch and go to the gym and lift weights or to get some exercise. Number 2, instead of donuts for breakfast, make a protein donut. Those things will help kind of alleviate some of those things that are going to happen as we go.
I mean, it can be a compromise. We can put the Netflix on at the gym, and you can still lift weights and watch your Netflix. But agree with you on the protein donut there.
Yeah.
I think breakfast is, it's typically a carb heavy meal, and carbs are great. Breakfast is my favorite meal of the day, but getting protein in at breakfast is such a missed opportunity, right? It's your first meal of the day. Get adequate protein in at your first meal of the day.
I've tried the fasting thing. I really did. For years ago when it first came, I was like, let me try this. And for a little while, I was like, I felt good, but I just love breakfast. When you mentioned, hey, it's your favorite, like this morning, I was like, I don't want to wait until 9, or I don't want to wait until after we record our podcast or whatever. I'd like to have my breakfast within about an hour of waking up. So it's always eggs. It's always either that or a smoothie with, at least 40 to 50 grams of protein. So I'm glad you mentioned that. All right, last question. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about, when it comes to this topic? Anything that we haven't discussed today that you said, hey, this would be good, or just anything in general?
Yeah, I think that, if you have a chance to go back and listen to Dr. Phillips' podcast, he really delves into a lot of the things that we didn't touch on today, and that's around protein quality, differences between plant and animal proteins. And this becomes particularly relevant as we age, where there are one of the essential amino acids, leucine, becomes important in being able, or it's always important, but maybe has more relevance as we move into older age, where we know that protein synthesis threshold is higher. So if you have a chance, go back and listen to Stu's podcast. I think another thing, Tavis, you and I already talked about 150 grams. That's our example of amount of protein to be consumed per day. That's a lot of protein. But trying to get that protein ingested in whole food forms is always going to be key, because when we consume protein in a whole food form, it means we're getting the other vitamins and minerals that come along with consuming a whole food. Where supplements come in is when we look at that 150 grams and say, okay, like I'm really full, I can't eat any more chicken. Maybe that's where we build it into, a shake or putting it on our oatmeal or something like that. I think protein supplements are secondary to food, and getting it through food and a healthy diet is always going to be key.
Thank you so much. No, that's fascinating. That's fascinating information all around this entire podcast. And I know this is going to be information that people can take with, because even still today, with things I study and learn, I'm still learning a lot of different things when it comes to the research, the science, how to adjust diet. I know longevity is a big topic in the world today, and this has been fantastic. So thank you, Dr. Oikawa, for giving us this information. You're not done yet, though. So I have some really unique questions that have nothing to do with today's podcast. This is called the curveball round, and you haven't seen these yet. So that's, typically with podcasts, we want to share our questions ahead of time so our guests can kind of prepare, right? We just don't want to like blind them with a random question. I've been on podcasts and that's not fun. But this is something you're blinded with. And I've done something different. Question 2 is going to be a question I've never asked a guest. I was like, let me do this. This might be a little cool because I would want to know, I would want to do this. But the first question is always the staple. It's about music. I'm a music junkie. So if you were the lead singer of any music group, band today or in the past, and you had one choice, who would that be?
Oh my gosh, that's a really hard question. I mean, I think like off the top of my head, it would be Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac, but I don't really have a really good answer for that. My music preferences are super eclectic. So going through my head, if you're wondering where I'm going with this, is I was trying to think about which of the genres I would prefer to sing, and I honestly can't. I can't pick one. I'm a big fan of Canadian, typically, I guess Canadian, but indie pop rock, and there's a lot of really great Canadian bands, but I wasn't going to throw out one of my kind of obscure groups to you there.
I think so. I've seen the Tragically Hip at Woodstock in '99. I am a massive fan of Finger 11 and also Our Lady Peace. Those are all 3 Canadian bands. I don't know much about the Tragically Hip, but Finger 11 and Our Lady Peace are probably 2 of my ultimate all-time favorite bands, and I think they're both from Canada.
Yeah, probably wouldn't pick a male vocal to replace.
Right, that'd be like me trying to sing soprano as a bass. I'd be like, wait a minute. Although my daughter and I play a lot of music, and I've played Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, and I've actually sung that, which it's a little bit easier because her voice is a little deeper. She's probably more like a mezzo, more like a mezzo, or I can't think of the term right now. I'm losing my thought process. But that's a great answer, and I know music is tough. All right, question 2. This is probably going to be a little bit more difficult. Let's say you didn't want to be a scientist, or you weren't a scientist. What's that dream job? Because if I go back and think of myself, I'd want to be in the sports broadcasting booth, or I'd want to be producing music for rock bands. Is there something that you'd say, man, I really wish I would have done this, now that where you are now, but is there like something that you just really missed, you felt like you missed out on and wanted to do as just a career?
This is actually a question I have an answer to. So this is also, let's frame this up as my answer is in like my pipe dream type of career. So in my past life, while I was working on my PhD, and then something that I'm hoping to do again soon, is I'm an indoor cycling instructor, a spinning instructor. I love being involved in fitness. This is not a shock considering my line of work. I also love music. I know that my last answer didn't really allude to that, but I do really love music. I love pairing music with exercise to motivate others. And so my pipe dream job would be to be a Peloton instructor.
Wow, that's fantastic. No, that's really cool.
I love spinning, and I love music, and I love encouraging others to be active. And I feel like that's a good way to build that out, to reach a lot of people.
I'm laughing because I was in the fitness industry for 13 years, and I used to go to spin classes a pretty good bit. When I worked in the fitness, we had fitness centers. So it was like lunchtime, go to spin class. I'm like, this person's music's killing me. It's awful. There's no motivation. They're playing like some kind of 80s pop song. And I'm like, I don't want to climb for 3 minutes to the song. You got to have something a little. And so in my head, I'm like thinking, oh, I'd have the greatest soundtrack for spinning that would motivate people. But I'm thinking maybe they don't like Tool. Maybe they don't like hard rock. So I don't know. It's just kind of fun.
It's a very personal choice, but I feel like I do an okay job.
All right, last question for you on our curveball round. Tell our listeners something about yourself that very few people know anything about.
Oh, that's a hard question. Do you have an example? Can you go first?
Yes. So I was the lead singer in a 90s alternative cover band for 6 years. And I don't tell, unless you know me, unless you're friends with me, live by me, saw me play, then I don't tell anybody about that. So this is kind of like a little, not a secret, but just nothing I really publicize.
Gotcha. Okay. It's probably not very good, but in COVID at least, I have had a lot of free time to myself and I got really back into reading. So I've been on pace to read about 100 books a year. And so if anyone wants to follow me on Goodreads, you can see what I'm up to reading. It's all not science-based for the most part. Just trying to get back into reading, diversify my reading genre portfolio. I'm a big nonfiction memoir type person, but trying to get into, of course, other genres of books if I'm going to read 100 a year. But that's what's been my new project outside of work.
100 books a year. Even if you would have said 24, I would have been like, wow. So 100. I think what you need to do is you need to like do a video of how you get through 100 books a year, because I still have 3 on my nightstand. And half of them are read and the other half are just like, my ADD brain's like, all right, I'll start one. And I even tried to read the book finish and I didn't finish it yet. So I was like, why am I reading these things? So you need to teach others how to get through 100 books a year, because that is just absolutely
It's having a lot of free time.
Yeah, no, you're right. And that's great. Well, Sara, thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible. A lot of valuable information for our listeners. So really appreciate you being here today and sharing your expertise.
Thanks for having me, Tavis. This was great.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.